Welcome back. This is the Ben Shapiro Show. We are joined on the line by Lieutenant Colonel James Carafano, VP of National Security and Foreign Policy at the Heritage Foundation. Lieutenant Colonel, thanks so much for joining the show. Appreciate it.
Good to be with you.
So let's talk about the election itself. There's a lot of talk in the lead up to the election about foreign election interference. We heard the media focusing specifically in on the Ruskies and how they were going to interfere in the election, presumably on behalf of Donald Trump. There was very little talk about China and Russia, China and North Korea and Iran interfering in the election. Particularly Iran and China on the other side. So did any of that materialize, and if so, in what ways?
The answer is kind of no. I mean, even, kind of outrageous claims, for example, when Hunter Biden laptop was getting a lot of attention and people in the Biden campaign were asked about it, and they all said, well, it's just Russian disinformation. Well, there's absolutely zero evidence that the investigation of Hunter Biden was generated by any kind of foreign manipulation at all. Zero evidence of that. And talking to folks in the intelligence community, they feel like there was very little foreign interference. Now, having said that, we put a lot of effort in 2018 and in this election in really kind of protecting the infrastructure. So there's zero evidence that anybody can suggest that any foreign entity changed a vote at all or interfered in an election infrastructure. There's also very, very little evidence that foreign disinformation played any role. Now, I'm not saying that's because they didn't try it. I think Russia, Chinese, Iranians, even the Chinese made very overt public efforts to kind of, but it had like zero impact. So this kind of bugaboo, we have to worry about foreign interference. I think in large part, one, it was that claim was largely political and ignored the reality of what we were doing to defend us. But also, I think it was really to distract from like the legitimate issue about voter integrity and our own ability to protect our voting systems and infrastructure from manipulation here from political voices.
So let's talk for a second about the kind of future of foreign relations here. So right now, obviously, we are still fighting out this election. There are legal processes to take place. I trust that the system will eventually reach its natural terminus. If the vote counts as of right now end up standing up, obviously Joe Biden is in the lead. It would take an extraordinary legal burden for the Trump campaign to prove voter fraud to the extent that it would overturn election results or get states suspended from the Electoral College or anything like that. So assuming, just for the sake of this conversation, that Joe Biden ends up becoming president-elect, how can we expect foreign policy to change? We've already heard from Ben Rhodes that the estimable failed novelist and Iran liar Ben Rhodes, that the Biden incoming team is holding conversations with foreign parties, which I used to think, I was told by Democrats reliably that when that happened, that was a violation of the Logan Act, right? I mean, that was the cause for initiation of legal processes against, by the way, Joe Biden recommended this himself, apparently, against Michael Flynn. So number one, let's talk about that for a second. Then let's talk about what any Biden administration would look like on foreign policy.
Well, look, having served on a transition team, I mean, that whole narrative was just made up. Look, anybody can talk to foreign governments anytime they want. All the Logan Act says that you cannot negotiate on part of the U.S. government, and foreign governments know that you can't because you're not in the government. So the notion of a violation of the Logan Act is a joke, and I think that was just used to destroy the career of a great patriot, Mike Flynn, and it was always a made-up thing, just like the foreign interference is. Not that there weren't efforts at foreign interference, but it was largely paid to political ends. I think that's true. Look, the reality of foreign policy is the world doesn't change. Geopolitics are the same. The notion that we're going to have completely different foreign policies, I mean, doesn't make a lot of sense. And when you hear like what can we bring to the table, people say we'll have a different tone. Well, if just talking differently to people could have dramatically different impacts, I think somebody would have thought of that by now. Even the things where the two candidates differed significantly, like on the Iran deal. Just saying we're going to go back to the Iran deal, that's a lot easier. That sounds easy, but it's actually a lot harder. What are you going to do about all the cheating? Do you really want to lift the arms embargo? Do you really want to flood the country with money? Do you really want to abandon all the countries that just lined up to normalize relations with Israel? So, this is what we were promised when Obama came in office. Everything would be different and better because we're noble and smarter and we speak better. Well, the reality is the Obama administration was 8 years of almost continuously bad defense and foreign policy. So when somebody comes to me and says, we're going to be smarter and we're going to have a different tone, to me, that's just a signal like you have nothing new to bring to the table.
So let's talk for a second about that Iran deal. So apparently They have signaled willingness to re-enter an Iran deal. I have a few questions about this. One, as you say, I don't even know how that's possible. Iran has already violated the terms of the Iran deal after the Trump administration pulled out, so they've already moved on with that. Number two, as we have seen, there is a burgeoning alliance between Israel, the UAE, and kind of covertly in the background, obviously, not so covertly, Saudi Arabia. If Team Biden, if they do enter office and then they attempt to make overtures to Iran, wouldn't it actually drive Saudi Arabia closer to Israel because they are going to be seeking some sort of security that they're not going to be able to receive directly from the United States, especially if the United States does what Barack Obama did and tries to make overtures to the Iranian mullahs?
Well, I think if you listen closely, actually, to what both campaigns said, both acknowledged that the end game was a better Iran deal, something that actually dealt with the real proliferation issues, that dealt with the concerns of countries in the region, that dealt with Iran's ballistic missile program. And that's really kind of the only way to go, is there has to be a stronger deal. And look, people forget this conversation, but Trump was very close to getting the Europeans to agree to go back to the Iranians and negotiate a stronger deal. I mean, it didn't come out in the end, and they kind of blinked. But even the Europeans recognized that the deal was inadequate. And look, the reality is the deal is dead. And so the only way forward is to negotiate a stronger deal. And here's the deal: is what would force the Iranians to do that? And it's the maximum pressure campaign. So if you just walk away from the enormous pressure that we put on the Iranian regime, you essentially relinquish the only tool you really have to drive a better deal.
So one of the other things I wonder about an Iran deal is in the last Iran deal, the Obama administration unilaterally declared that an Iran deal would be considered an executive agreement and then cut a deal with Bob Corker to have essentially a 51 vote up or down. Do you like the deal or do you not like the deal? And then the Democrats even filibustered that. So the Republicans were unable to vote down the deal. If Joe Biden were to attempt to enter an Iran deal, I wonder if the courts would be so sanguine about that. I wonder if this would be seen as a treaty under the Constitution of the United States, requiring a 60-vote threshold in the Senate that he couldn't get.
Well, here would be my advice, regardless of who's the president in January: pressure the Iranians to do a real deal, which actually addresses the proliferation issues and the ballistic missile issue and their regional behavior. Stick out and get that deal. And then when you get that deal, do it as a treaty, because a treaty is a much more powerful, reliable instrument. And a greater, I think, would be a greater reassurance to the Iranians that we were actually going to stick with the deal. That would be my advice.
Okay, so meanwhile, on China, there's been a lot of suspicion that any Biden administration would be much more conciliatory with the Chinese government. Specifically, Joe Biden repeatedly refused to label them enemies or even opponents in open debate. What do you think China policy looks like under Joe Biden? By the way, quick side note here. There's a lot of talk about Susan Rice's Secretary of State, which is just a disaster area in every way. Do you think that she is the likely pick for Secretary of State? And if so, why don't we go with the Susan Rice question first, and then we'll go to China?
Well, look, I don't know who, if Biden were elected, who he would appoint as his officials. Look, all the people surrounding their campaign in the foreign national security space are the former Obama people. They have a long track record. Their track record is one of failure after failure after failure. So if you hire the same team, I don't know how you would expect to get different results. In China, look, I mean, the reality is getting tough with China has really reset the table, and it is the best hope to really kind of contain China's global malicious influence. You can't walk away from that. And this, talk about, well, we're going to be really smart about this and nuanced about that. You'll just get steamrolled by the Chinese. And ironically, the Chinese are kind of on the ropes. They are more inwardly focused. They recognize that there's more pushback on the international stage. Letting China out of the box, in the way we let the Iranians out of the box under Obama, that would be a disastrous foreign policy. And then we just have to claw our way back from it.